Wonderful. So thank you so much for helping to sort this out, and I'm happy to be here. I'm happy also to have, I was saying, when nobody could hear me, Jana's assistance in fielding questions, because it will be harder for me to speak and also be watching the questions. So I appreciate her help with that, and figuring this out. But I'm just really thrilled to be here and to be able to speak with you all about designing and publishing qualitative research. And I think it's a really exciting time in the fields. So forward, please. The Our field is at a really interesting moment in time where over the last decades we've really focused on developing a large amount of research that engages in psychotherapy comparisons, and in which people have one psychotherapy orientation and another, and they're put through different RCTs or clinical trials, and look to see, which one seems to be superior. And we've also accumulated a lot of evidence to show that we seem to find equivalence in bona fide psychotherapy orientations, that there don't seem to be differences, and that the differences that emerge occur at the number that we would expect simply by chance. And when we think about what are the next questions going to be then in our field, right? How are we going to move forward in terms of asking questions about what is important in psychotherapy? What should we be studying? What are the variables and the concerns that will be of interest in moving our understanding forward about what psychotherapy is? It's quite unclear, and this creates, I think, a lot of opportunity for qualitative research to come in to help shape answers to those questions. And this is a difficult sort of process because as psychotherapists, we've been acculturated in such a way that we think about psychotherapy as akin to psychotherapy orientation. When we think about what we do as psychotherapists, we often describe that in our psychotherapy as our psychotherapy orientations, as simply sort of our interventions, what we do in session, and our identities are very tied up with that. So we think of ourselves as, oh, I am an emotion-focused psychotherapist, or a psychodynamic, or a CBT therapist, and our groups, our conferences often fall into those identities. Our journals often fall into those identities, but at the same time, we're finding that those differences between orientations don't seem to be the factors that are really significant when it comes to client outcome. So this leaves us this question of, what do we decide to focus on next as a field, and how do we develop new understandings of psychotherapy and new questions, really, that will give us a paradigm that, will result in more significant findings. And so we're left with that question, right? Let's forward to the next slide, please. So instead of thinking about just what we do behaviorally in session, right, which I think is interesting and I'm not saying isn't worthy of exploration, we can begin to develop more complex understandings by looking also at what is happening to the people who are engaging in it. What are the processes that are occurring within clients, within therapists who are doing this kind of work? And we see that client effects, therapist effects, the relationship, these seem to carry much more weight in terms of the variance in client outcome than psychotherapy orientation. And these are experiences that really can be tapped into through qualitative methods and in a uniquely rich and informative kind of way. Let's go to the next slide. To give you an example, right? So what types of understandings do qualitative inquiry permit? I have an example from a session in which the client was describing being depressed, and the therapist had been asking the client to think about what she could say to herself to help her feel better. And the client in the session had been struggling to do this, and so the therapist attempted another kind of tact or another kind of intervention. And so here, the therapist says, let's see if we could have it, maybe we could have an interactive kind of moment. Can two people volunteer to be the therapist and the client for me? So the therapist says, what would a friend tell you, right? She's asking about how she could help herself feel better. A close friend, the client replies. Okay, go ahead, please.
Somehow that doesn't help me.
Okay, what would you like to hear from a close friend? Or what would you tell a close friend, sorry, who was in your shoes?
Very long pause. I suppose I tell a person in my shoes to have enough confidence in their proven ability to set limits.
Is that the evidence against the depressive thought? And so they're continuing, they have a record sheet in front of them, and they're filling this out, right, with the evidence against the thought. What do you think the therapist is thinking and the client is thinking during this excerpt here?
Please raise your hand if you would like to say something, and I will unmute you.
It will be way more fun if people raise their hands.
Okay, Martina Fischer's worrying. I will put you online. Should we continue? Sorry. This was very. I will try again. Martina, can you hear me?
No, it's a fail.
Sorry, I have to mute you. The feedback sound is very bad. I would try with Nicholas Morrison.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, great. Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. So I guess, my guess as I'm hearing about this, my guess would be that maybe the therapist is slightly frustrated that the client isn't actually providing the form of evidence that the therapist wanted. That would be my guess.
Okay, so the therapist may be feeling kind of frustrated because the client is pausing quite a bit and maybe not providing a lot of rich evidence. How do you think? What do you think the client's feeling? What do you think is happening for the client? Do you feel like it's?
Yeah, I think maybe the client is feeling frustrated that they're again not able to come up with the right answer, or feel like they're not meeting the therapist's expectations.
Okay, so thank you very much, Nicholas.
Sure.
So it's interesting, I think, because we have we have this text, and in the text you see, and and especially without the pauses, it would be hard to get a sense of this. But in the text you see that the therapist is asking, for a question, and the client comes up with an answer. And the client comes up with an answer that, it may not be as rich as the therapist wants, but just looking at the text, the client comes up with an answer that seems like it's, encouraging, an encouraging sort of response that she would be telling to herself as a friend, right? And looking at the text, you might think, okay, well, it's a therapy intervention that's proceeding kind of awkwardly, but maybe the client is taking a long time to come to this insight. Maybe this is a hard insight for her. Maybe it's a struggle. It's hard to know what's happening exactly inside, although you can get, especially with the pauses, I think, a sense of like something. Here we can look at from the IPR interview. So I ask the client, tell me what you're thinking, what's happening for you. So an IPR interview is an interpersonal process recall interview, and these are interviews where you sit with the client with the recording of a quite recent session, usually within 3 days, and you play the session, and the client will stop the tape whenever they get to an important moment, and then the client will describe what that moment was about for them. So here, the client's describing this moment, and she says, the idea is, what would a friend tell me if they can't think, if you can't think of what you would tell yourself, but they've said all the wrong things for a long time now. So she's saying her friends have said all the wrong things. Her friends haven't been helpful. So I was remembering that they haven't been terribly helpful. So now I'm in a position where I have to tell them something that will be quite positive. And I don't have anything left for them, is what I was thinking. And I know this is a theoretical situation, and actually the friend I'm talking to is myself, and probably I don't have that much love for myself either. So then I'm stuck. I know how I talk to myself, and if I say this, it feels like a lie if I say that I'm going to say positive things to myself, because it's not what I tell myself. It's what I should be telling myself if I were my friend, if my friend was supportive. So it got very convoluted. I wasn't forgiving my friends for the past year of letting me down, and I wasn't letting myself off the hook either in order to do the leap to complete this task. So later I asked her what she was experiencing at the end of this, when they moved to filling out the sheet. And she says, oh, I feel disbelief in what I just said. And she describes her experience of therapy as pressure to come up with the right answer, like in the game show Jeopardy. So she has this experience that's where she's really experiencing quite a bit of internal turmoil and doubt and disbelief in what she's saying. And if you just look at the text, it's quite hard to see what's really happening. All of this internal kind of experience that's happening as she's engaging in this kind of process. And this is partially, the beauty of qualitative research, that you can go into the internal process beyond what the words are and discover sometimes different ways that clients are experiencing moments and different ways that therapists are understanding what they're doing in their session or making decisions about what they're doing that may not be evident when we think about, what are the steps of an intervention, or even the transcript. Let's proceed to the next slide, please. Mm-hmm. So advantages of qualitative methods. So this is something that really these methods help you do. They can help you figure out what is happening in terms of the therapist's intentions. Oh, sorry, I forgot to say to advance. So go forward again, please. Mm-hmm. That was just the part that I just read about the client, so you heard that. Okay, so advantages of qualitative methods are that you get a sense of what's happening in the therapy, that accounts for the client's agency. So the client in the session is making decisions. Do I want to really engage in this task? Do I not want to? Do I just want to humor my therapist? Do I feel deferent to my therapist and feel, clients often come to therapy feeling like they're somewhat desperate for help and they want to please their therapist. It's very hard for clients to deny a therapist's request or to argue with their therapist for many clients. So they may just go along even though they don't internally believe in what they're saying or doing. And also it can help to explicate the therapist's intention. So as a therapist is making an intervention, how do they tailor that intervention and why do they tailor it? What are the rationales and what are the cues that they're focusing on? All of these sorts of questions can be pulled out, and it permits the development of principles that can guide the change process from both the therapist and client perspective, and can capture the flexibility and decisions in these sorts of processes. And I've written about that in some detail. But these can lead to, you can develop grounded hypotheses for mixed methods research. You could develop items for quantitative measures types of experiences that could evolve into process measures that could be used, treatment center recommendations, attuned, contextualized guidance for therapists. So there's many different kinds of outcomes that can happen. Next slide, please. The challenge of that qualitative researchers often face, though, is that it's somewhat harder to publish qualitative research because most academics haven't been trained in these methods. And even for myself, when I was in graduate school, we had no course on qualitative methods that was offered. And today, many programs don't have courses that are taught in qualitative methods. And especially required courses that are taught in qualitative methods. So it becomes a little bit trickier because researchers who are reviewing articles may not have a good depth of understanding of how these methods work and what's different about them. And it may also be trickier to find mentoring, right, and support for doing qualitative research as a student. So there's been, I think, happily, some very positive shifts in the field that have been happening. So there are more people now who have some familiarity with qualitative methods and different epistemological perspectives. And so that is really exciting, but sometimes there's not as much depth of understanding to allow them to review across methods that they're less familiar with, or perspectives or epistemologies that they may be less familiar with. Let's go to the next slide, please. So some of my work has been focusing on this kind of concern and this issue, and specifically a kind of growing tendency to evaluate research by how well it seems to match the procedures used in the original form of a method. So for example, sometimes people will seem to be reviewing articles by thinking about, well, these are the main steps of grounded theory. Have you done these main steps? So sort of almost like a checklist of procedures or a cookbook kind of idea of reviewing. And there's an element of methodology in here where the idea is to fix the method and then to see, is the person who's submitting the article using the method in this fixed kind of way. And there's many challenges with this because it makes it more difficult for researchers to flexibly apply methods, and it can make it more difficult for them to really produce meaningful research. Let's go to the next slide, please. So there's many methods that you can choose from in terms of qualitative research. And I'm going to talk a little bit about I'll talk a little bit about some of the point of choosing a method, then I'm going to go back to this issue in terms of the tailoring and the flexible use of methods. But just first, before we talk about that, just how to select a method at all. As a qualitative researcher, the way you're going to think about selecting methods, I think most usefully, will be based upon your question. So wondering, what is the thing that you really want to know, and what would be most useful for you to know, right? Do you have one central question? Do you have a number of questions? Having a sense of what you're looking for will really guide you to choose a method that's most useful in developing answers for that sort of question. So you may want to develop a model of something, and you may want to look at grounded theory or thematic analyses, or if you're thinking about, I really want to develop a sense of the deep personal meaning of something, phenomenology is a method that specifically focuses on that, but others could be really useful too. Maybe that narrative or grounded theory or other processes or qualitative consensual analyses can be useful too. Understanding deep, it's implicit interpersonal and social forces. So if you can understand the thinking about the things that aren't being said, right? I may be interested in looking in my research at sessions and thinking about, let's see, can you go ahead, please?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry, maybe you need to go behind, actually. I feel like I'm on how to select a method. So one more up. Okay. So, all right. So, all right. I'm on one that says how to select a method, which is after the mission. So, I don't know. Yeah, you're more ahead of me. I'm still behind you. So,
How to tell? Oh,
Yes,
yeah.
there, that's where I am. Yeah. So, so thinking about how to select methods, if you're looking for something that's implicit, you may want to do a discourse analysis. You could do a feminist discourse analysis or a queer theory or you could bring different sorts of theories to look and see, like what are the methods, what are the things that are implicit that are hidden in the assumptions that are being used within this session, right? What is the therapist not saying, but it's guiding their actions as they interact with clients of different races or backgrounds or sexual orientations or whatnot. And there's different methods that have been developed to track that implicit kind of actions and sessions. Developing new understandings, consensual qualitative research, content analysis could be methods, but there could be, for many of these, there are more than one possible method. And it would be thinking about, again, like what will best answer your question. Helping a community resolve a problem, you may want to go into a treatment community and work with them to create a treatment that would be really useful for the type of client that they're seeing or the type of situation that they have in their community. So as you pick this, you'll think about what's really most useful for you. Do you need to have detailed, organized information? Do you need to have something that has 50 categories in it? Would that be useful? Maybe that's too much information. Maybe what you want is a few central distinctions that you can really focus therapists on integrating and internalizing. Maybe you want something that's more theory-driven or community-focused. So thinking about, again, what's most useful for you, and your question is where people typically will begin. Next slide, please. So in terms of meaningful methods, though, whatever method you pick, you're going to want to tailor it to your research topic and your context. And think about the questions that will lead to findings that will make your research really meaningful and have the impact that you're wanting. And this might require that you adapt your method because of your study topic or the study characteristics that you're using. Let's go to the next page, please. So, the goal of some of this work that I'm talking about today was really to try to articulate a rationale for the adaptation of methods. So how do we understand what is a legitimate sort of rationale? How do we put forward these rationales that authors can use and reviewers can use when they're designing and evaluating their work? And our concern here isn't to supplant procedure. We're not saying that procedure and methods, should be thrown out the window. They can be really helpful in providing a guide and a template and a format to approach methods, and they are really useful in communicating what we're doing between researchers. But thinking about, how things may need to be adapted can be very useful in terms of creating findings that are more meaningful. Let's go to the next page, please. So in the Society for Qualitative Research in Psychology, we developed this task force, which was focusing on this question. And as part of this task force, what we came up with was the idea of methodological integrity. And methodological integrity is framed as the methodological basis of trustworthiness. So trustworthiness is the criteria for rigor that I think is most frequently cited when we describe qualitative methods, that we want our research to be something that we can believe in, that we can think this is something that I have faith in, the findings. But that could be quite broad, and it doesn't really specify any specific methodological features, this idea of trustworthiness. So I could find your paper trustworthiness because you're my friend and I like you, or because you're a researcher who I respect, or because you're investigating experience that is similar to an experience that I had. So there could be many reasons to have trustworthiness that aren't methodological specifically. And we're really wanting to focus on, well, what are the methodological basis for, what is the methodological basis for trustworthiness? So, and consider how it's strengthened when research procedures can be tailored to the researcher's goals and approaches to inquiry. And so when I say approaches to inquiry, I mean things like their epistemological perspective or their pragmatic kind of attitude in terms of being question focused. And I'll talk about that more in a second. And how they're tailoring it to the subject matter and investigator. So we should be on the page that says the second methodological integrity page. So up a couple more, up more, one more. Okay, no, seems like it's going down. So,
is this the right?
Can you go? No, it should say methodological integrity on it. So let's see, go up more, up more, up more.
This one?
No, up more. Keep going up. Yeah, one more up. There you go. Okay. So here's some examples of when procedures might need to be altered.
Yeah, sorry, Heidi. I think we have a couple of questions. Would it be okay for people to ask now?
Sure.
Yeah. There's someone raising their hand.
Yeah.
So this is Catherine Reich. I think you wanted to ask a question. I will put you on.
Sure.
Okay, you can speak now, I think.
No, I'm sorry. No, I wanted to ask a question. Not a question. I was trying to participate back when we were doing the therapist part.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Sorry.
Okay, but there was someone else. Let me check. Arno Laitilia, I think.
Yeah. I tried to ask for Heidi's voice because I lost it for a moment. So that I don't have a specific questions right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your putting your hands up when you have questions. I know it's kind of a little bit awkward, the webinar kind of format, but we'll kind of hang with it. And you know, it seems like it's working out now, which is nice. But let me give you some descriptions, because if you do have questions, these examples may help to clarify some things. So here's some examples of when procedures may need to be altered. So for instance, you know, my dissertation was on silences in therapy, and the main finding that I had, so before my dissertation, people tended to look at silences by just tabulating the number of seconds of silence in a session and grouping them together. And the main finding that I had was that people's experiences of silence there were different types of silences, and that the different types reflected really different internal experiences. And so just summing up the numbers of seconds in a session didn't really match onto what was happening inside for the client. They were productive kinds of silences, and ones where clients were getting in touch with feelings or reflecting or trying to find words. And there were ones that were more obstructive, where the client was blocked or stuck, right? Like what we were looking at in our little excerpt before. And so even though grounded theory method typically leads towards having a hierarchy of categories with a core category, I decided it didn't make sense to have a core category, because my main finding is that there's not a core category, is that there's not a common feature, right? So this would be a time when I want to adapt the procedures that I'm using within the method that I'm using, and I want to do something different because it doesn't fit for my data. You may be doing research on people who are hard to reach or hard to find to give feedback. And if you're using a method that typically leads to participants giving feedback, that might not be possible. If you have students, if you're interviewing in a counseling center seniors who are about to graduate, you may not be able to find them to give you feedback at the end of the study. And so there may be things that have to be adapted. The way you question things, if you're researching trauma, you may have to ask different kinds of questions than if you're researching a topic that's less emotionally charged. So in terms of subject, there are all these different ways that what you're researching may change what you do, right? As an investigator, who you are may also change it. So you may or may not be part of a community that you're investigating. You may have more or fewer resources or people who are working with you as co-investigators in the research, and that may change what you do. So for instance, I've done research in lesbian communities that I've been part of, and the way I approach that research and structure my interviews is different because the participants may be people who I know and a community that I'm part of. So how you think about your research and your methods may change because of who you are as well. Next slide, please. In terms of the your epistemology, your approach to your research may also change the way you proceed, right? In terms of the procedures you select, and the and most of our well-known qualitative methods in psychology have been formulated using different epistemologies. So if you're familiar with, content analysis using a post-positive perspective, that could look quite different from one using a critical feminist perspective or a critical race perspective or a constructivist perspective. So how you see research may lead you to shape your methods really differently. So in terms of when we think of a post-positive approach, this is sort of the approach that is dominant in psychology right now, where we believe that there's one true sort of reality that's out there, but we sort of have some flaws in our ability to apprehend that. And so we try to develop as sensitive measurement tools as possible. We try to be careful in terms of, reducing the sorts of different sources of error that could be influencing our measurement or assessment of what we're looking at. We tend to be very objectivist. There tends to be a more dualist perspective where the investigator and subject are seen as more detached, and a focus often on theory falsification, right? In terms of, if I had a constructivist interpretive perspective, which now is the dominant perspective in psychotherapy qualitative research, having recently completed a meta-method study on the qualitative research on clients in psychotherapy, and we found that it was by far the dominant perspective. Researchers tend to think that there could be multiple valid realities. There could be the reality that the client is having, which could be quite different than the reality of the therapist in the session. They could both be valid. We believe that we have a more subjectivist approach as a constructivist. You're thinking about your research more as something that you are enmeshed with, that you're very aware that your questions, that the way you interact with your participants can change with the kind of data that they provide. And that your values and your beliefs and your expectations or hopes of your findings can also have an effect on your data. And so there's a lot of self-awareness that's developed where researchers work to try to be cautious and limit or be transparent about the effects of their own perspectives. And often there's a focus here on developing understanding. And I think the last column here focuses more on this critical approach to research, in which there's an interest in looking at how people's experiences are shaped by social forces, and an interest in thinking about, how does our broader context impact how we're experiencing ourselves? How does the fact that we live in cultures that often have racist and sexist and heterosexist and ableist and all sorts of assumptions, how does that bleed into the client's experience of themselves? And an interest in looking at the sort of dialogue between these sorts of external values and how they're transmitted, potentially in session or from within the client. And often the goal of that research is really on transformation. How do we change something? How do we change how therapists and clients interact? How do we change what's happening in our healthcare systems, etc.? So depending on what approach you use in terms of your epistemologies, what is good research could be quite different. Is your research falsifying or proving something? Is your research developing an understanding? Is your research changing something? Those are three really different criteria for what is good research. And as a researcher, it can be, you also may approach your work pragmatically and not hold one of these positions very tightly, but it can be useful to think about what you value as a researcher and what outcome is important for you, and that also may help you in selecting in your procedures and your methods. Next slide, please. So this is kind of an overview here on methodological integrity, and here we have outcomes. We have fidelity and utility, which are the main concepts, and I'm going to talk about this for probably the rest of the time that I'll be talking. And then there's these boxes that are on the left side that focus on data collection, and the boxes on the right side that focus on data analysis. And I'm going to go through these kinds of concepts with you now. Are there any questions before I do that? Because it will help you understand more of the how and why do you adapt methods to make them more meaningful.
Okay, if you have any questions, please raise your hand now. But it seems that no, there are no questions at the moment.
Okay,
oh,
great.
There's one question from Evelyn Koyai. I will put you on. There you go. Hello, can we hear you?
Yeah.
Hello.
Could you please explain more about fidelity? Because I don't really understand what is it.
Okay, perfect question. Let's go down 2 slides, please.
Mm-hmm. So go back 2 slides, you mean?
No, down, forward 2 slides, please.
Yeah.
All right.
This one?
Yeah. Yes, please. So, so fidelity is this idea that as qualitative researchers, what we really want is to develop data and findings that will provide a clear and vivid portrayal of what our phenomenon is. So we really want to understand what is this phenomenon that we're studying. We want the picture to be as clear as possible and as comprehensive as possible. And we understand this in a relationship. This doesn't have to be a realist kind of idea. It doesn't necessarily mean that we think that this phenomenon is existing as an entity in reality. So I could study something like the alliance that I see as a interpersonal construction, right? But I still want to have my findings have fidelity to people's experience of the alliance, right? I do a lot of research on lesbian gender. Even if I see it as constructed, I would still want to show that that my data holds true to that experience, right? And this could be related to any psychotherapy process or diagnosis. And so we're wanting to capture some sort of semblance of the phenomenon. And the better the semblance, the stronger the understanding of the boundaries and the relationships between that phenomenon and other phenomena, the better, right? So this is one of the core things that we're looking for as researchers. And let's talk a little bit about how you would see that. So there's 4 elements of fidelity and 4 of utility. The first 2 being in data collection. Let's go to the next slide. So, the first thing is to think about the adequacy of the data that we have. So thinking about the how adequate is your data to give a comprehensive picture of what you're studying. Often researchers try to look for as diverse kinds of data as they can deliberately to try to get a picture of this phenomenon. And so you're thinking about, well, what is adequate? It wouldn't make sense as a researcher to say, well, I'm going to try to look for simply all kinds of participants from every race and gender and age and sexual orientation and ability status. It would be, you couldn't do a qualitative study that would be like that, right? It would be very impossible. But so instead you think about, what is my phenomenon, and what are the types of variants that seem to be evident in that phenomenon, and seem to be differences that would be at play in reference to that. And you typically, qualitative researchers will begin off with some sort of understanding of what their phenomenon and what differences within that phenomenon what differences might be important. But as they collect data, they keep noticing where are points of difference that are being brought into the data and that people are mentioning or describing, and that may lead them to quite deliberately select for certain types of participants to help enrich and make their data more comprehensive. So this would be a way that you think about fidelity in data collection in terms of its adequacy. Next slide, please. We also think about the appropriate management of the researcher's perspective. Let's go to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, yeah, this is it. So so thinking about how you, right, affect your data, and how qualitative researchers often use many different tools and techniques to help them, like note-taking or memoing or self-reflection, discussion with co-researchers, being very aware, describing how they constructed or co-constructed the data, and and being aware of how their own experiences. So reviewers sometimes will ask things like, well, you did have this experience, so your data collection wasn't valid. You were biased. Or you didn't have this experience, so your data collection wasn't valid because you don't really know about it. So the important thing here is that regardless of the researcher's direct experience with the phenomenon, they should be recognizing and reducing the undue influence of their perspectives on the data. And so in a quite transparent way within their writing. Next slide, please. So keeping with this idea of data collection, when we think about utility, we're thinking about so this is the second big concept within methodological integrity. We're thinking about how we want to deliberately use our procedures to allow the researchers to have the most insightful understandings, to be able to answer their questions in the way that will be most useful. And so this could be, again, considered in terms of your epistemologies, as we discussed before. What do you value? What do you see as the goal of your work? And it could lead to many different types of outcomes, like developing understandings, or it could have clinical utility, giving therapists guidance. It could help you identify a social process or a hypothesis for a future quantitative study you'd like to do, create social change, etc. So the usefulness, right, is the second big concept here within methodological integrity. Next slide, please. And within data collection, we try to think about having our data be catalysts for insight. We want to collect data that's as useful as possible. So we often think carefully about who should be interviewing. Do I want to have myself be interviewing? Do I want to have a graduate student be interviewing? Do I want to interview with someone from an organization where I'm working? So the principle here is, when selecting interviewers, considering the types of skills, the knowledge needed, and the influence of the researcher's relationships and power status, so that your data can lead to the most insightful and useful findings. Next slide, please. And finally, with the data collection, you want to think about the contextualization. So really being careful as you're describing your data and even presenting quotes to provide the context in which they can be understood. And that context could be things like the dynamic that's happening in the interview at that moment. It could be the larger location of this data collection, the culture within this is occurring, the interpersonal process. And so the people who are reading it will be able to make sense of your findings and think about how they can apply that themselves to their own situations. So the principle here is basically to provide contextual information to help researchers engage in a process of appropriate transferability. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So when we think about data analysis, let's see. There's a little pause. Okay, and the next one more. We also think about fidelity and utility. So when we think about fidelity, again, we're interested in this sort of clear portrait, right, of the phenomenon you're investigating. Let's go down one more slide. And the, yeah, that's good. Yeah, perfect. The one with the arrows and the two people, yeah. So thinking about now that we're in analysis, how do you as researchers, how does your perspective influence your analysis? And part of this is thinking about, you know, how you're engaging in analysis quite deliberately and quite transparently within your work. The concern that qualitative researchers often come against is this charge that they're being too biased. But qualitative researchers, they tend to analyze the research and they tend to manage their perspective in data analysis in one of two ways. So data collection, they're usually simply working to limit their influence, which is one of the two ways. And so they could try to use things like memoing and self-reflection and to try to think about how could my perspective distort the data in some way or change the data in some way that I think is undue, and to try to limit that. Or they may overtly use their perspectives as analytic tools. So you might approach your research from critical race theory perspective, for instance, and you might look at your text through that lens and try to identify, how different sorts of stereotypes or prejudices are being evidenced. And so here the principle that we're communicating is that researchers want to try to really address which of those two approaches or how they're combining approaches or using potentially different approaches to engage in their data analysis. So there's transparency. Next slide, please.
Okay. Sorry, we did actually have a question from Tien Mandel, which
all right,
which I can read out. He or she, I'm not sure, is asking, would fidelity map onto validity in terms of concept, or otherwise, how do we integrate validity and reliability onto fidelity and utility? Or are these terms usefully applied specifically to qualitative methodology?
Yeah, so validity tends to be, and reliability, they really emerge from a perspective that's post-positivist, and so there's sort of an assumption that there is this kind of reality that's out there, and that is one reality, and that you're trying to map, right, through your research. And you can do research as a qualitative researcher from a post-positive perspective, but often but typically people again are not really adapting that framework, and when they do, they're typically combining it with a constructivist framework. So in the meta-method study that is going to come out in the Journal of Counseling Psychology that was conducted by myself and Andrew Palmerville and Francisco Sarase and Lauren Grabowski, we found that there were very few post-positivist oriented papers within the ones that indicated an epistemological approach, and those that were post-positivist often were post-positivist as well as constructivist. So like consensual qualitative research that has sort of a hybrid kind of foundation. And so often when we think about fidelity, we're thinking about it, so it could be thought of as something that's a proxy for validity, because we're trying to show that this is something that exists, but it does have a different sort of implication because it doesn't need to be interpreted in a realist sort of way, right? So we're thinking about fidelity to the phenomenon as it's constructed by the researchers, which could be in a very socially constructed kind of manner or otherwise. And when we think about reliability, again, that becomes questioned in some ways, because if you do believe that there are multiple types of experiences that are valid of the same sort of thing, then you may not expect to have reliability, right? You may, as qualitative researchers, we're often investigating things that we don't think will be replicated, or we don't think will be replicated exactly across contexts. So if I research, for instance, the experience of what it means to be a woman in Massachusetts today, it will be very different than the experience of what it means to be a woman in, I don't know, China in the 1900s, right? So looking at, so there's a different sort of expectation for reliability. That said, if you're using a post-positivist framework, you may engage in activities to try to enhance your reliability. And so people will do things like sometimes have multiple raters, provide inter-rater reliability, but it's quite rare that people are doing this overall in qualitative methods. I'm hoping that helps to answer that question.
Yes, it's she just wrote, or he wrote that it's very helpful and clear.
Oh, thank you. So in terms of seeking fidelity again, the second way of thinking about fidelity is to, in your analysis, is to be careful and think about how your analysis is rooted in your findings. So really wanting your analysis to come from, your findings to come from that analysis. And because of that, qualitative researchers tend to provide rich examples of their analytic process. We tend to provide quotes, we tend to describe how we developed our understandings from the quotes, and we often pay quite a bit of attention to that. So this is one principle that can help us in thinking about how we may want to alter procedures to let us be more grounded. There may be certain movements we want to make. Next slide, please.
Okay. Would it be okay to have another question? I just saw someone else raise their hand.
Let me do. I have really two more slides, okay. and then I feel like I'll be at a stopping. I'll be stopping, and so then that would be a good place. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
So let's go forward one more. So that's the groundedness one, okay, so this is just reminding about what utility is again, this idea of seeking meaning. And let's see, let's see, I'm trying to think if I can you hear my phone ringing? I'm not sure really what to do about it, other than to just let it stop. So in terms of seeking utility, this is that again, the idea that you want it to be as useful as possible. And let's go to the next slide. And that usefulness is defined by the goals of your study. So again, those goals could be set up quite differently. So being aware of your goals lets you think about how to tailor your procedures. So in terms of the analysis, the two principles again, one being on meeting the contribution. So you're wanting really to develop findings that will serve your goals and that will advance the literature, right? You want findings that will move us ahead in some way, give us a better understanding, that will give us a pathway in terms of making changes in the world. And so our principle is feedback from, so I guess questions sometimes that we get from reviewers, and some journals historically have mandated feedback from all participants. And this can be a useful kind of tool, but it may not fit the goals and the methods and traditions of all studies. And that there may be many reasons and many questions in which feedback from all participants is not necessary. And so having some clarity about, what is a useful contribution? Can you make a useful and meaningful contribution without having that, right? If it's not possible. So part of this process and this paper, this task force paper that was put forward, is really to help researchers have responses to reviewers. So through all of these different principles that we've been talking about, their purpose really is so that you can argue, no, I don't need this, right? It's not advancing my fidelity, it's not advancing my utility as you receive feedback. And to help you make coherent kinds of arguments that can help you create more meaningful kinds of work. Next slide, please. So I think this will be our last slide here. It was focusing on the idea of coherence between meanings. I think this is sometimes the trickiest part for qualitative researchers, especially when they're beginning, is developing meanings in their analysis that make sense in relationship to each other. And researchers often will use diagrams or narrative or different representations to try to get across their meanings. What this means is that as you're creating your results, you're going to want to think about how to make them coherent. So if you find that you have a client saying, I really dislike X about therapy, and you have another client saying, I really love X about therapy, then it will be your job to think through, how can I make these two statements coherent? How can I integrate them for the researcher so that my findings become meaningful? Simply presenting two different categories may not be as useful as thinking about, well, when is X important and when is X not important? Or when is X problematic and when is it not problematic? Or in what situation? Or is it that X is usually problematic except for these cases? Thinking about what are the relationships between the statements, I think is the work of the researcher, so that when you present your results, people know how to use them. So the principle here is simply, delving into the differences within the data, explaining clearly how they relate to one another will enhance your coherence and allow researchers to meet their goals and allow readers to make use of the research. So I'm going to stop there. I've been talking for a while. I don't know if there are questions people have.
Okay, I will.
I'd be happy to answer them.
I will put Nehama Hakohen on now.
Great. Hi, Nehama.
Hi, actually, my name is Rivka.
Rivka.
Yeah. So I just took Nehami's place because she wasn't able to attend. A question to Heidi about seeking fidelity and analysis. You present it as if the choice is of the researcher to decide whether he can acknowledge his perspective and work to limit the influence, or he can use his perspective as an analytic tool. But my experience is that many times, because reviewers come from a post-positivistic approach, or because they're not enough aware of qualitative methodologies, they require researchers to explain their work in terms of positivistic or post-positivistic explanations, meaning that there's not so much freedom to really decide whether you want to use your perspective as an analytic tool, but you have to clean or limit or diminish your own reflection or own bias. So yes. I wanted to ask you about it, if there's a mismatch sometimes between reviewers, or your experience is that it's really open for researchers to just state what perspective they use.
Yes, I appreciate your asking that question. I think that you're very right? I think that we are in a field where most reviewers are often approaching us from a very post-positivist place. And in part, this is the reason why we've written this, why this task force came to write this piece. What we're hoping is that the piece can be used for researchers to cite and to try to argue back. Sometimes it's very hard to argue with reviewers about why you are making a change or why you are using your method this way or that way and how that's valid. And so part of our ambition in writing this task force paper has been to provide tools for researchers when they're engaging with reviewers who don't understand qualitative research. As part of it, something that we're trying to do also is to make recommendations to journals. So we're recommending that journals, so right now within psychotherapy research within our society journal, I'm the qualitative action editor, so associate editor. So when qualitative manuscripts come in, they typically will come to me. And we recommend that all journals have people who are designated as, and there are other, I'm not the only person who has, on the board either who can do that, but often, that's one area that I focus in. But we recommend that journals broadly designate people who have skills to do these kinds of reviews, and that they're more cautious about who should be doing these kinds of reviews at the beginning as the action editor. Also, we recommend that people try to find reviewers who are skilled in qualitative methods. And a fortunate thing about our society is that we have quite a number of reviewers who have qualitative method skills, which is quite nice. And so that, makes it a more welcoming, our journal more welcoming for qualitative research. But something that you can do as a researcher is to write to the editor and ask if your paper could be, when you submit, ask if your paper could be submitted to qualitative researchers as reviewers. And that can be helpful to just flag that. And I think to also just be aware that you can use your review process to educate the reviewers. So, often I really see the review process as one where you, as a qualitative researcher, have an opportunity to educate and to take that really seriously. So sometimes my response letters to papers that I submit, they can be 20 pages long because I'm providing a lot of education for reviewers and editors, and I hope that I feel like it does. I feel like it does assist, because then I think that the editors, they begin to understand qualitative methods more, and then that may influence how they receive that may influence how they receive your work, but also the work of other people, right, who are submitting to that journal. And so it can help, develop more opportunities for qualitative researchers broadly. So I really try to, encourage that perspective when I speak to people on this topic of really using the review process as an educational moment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm just checking, but it seems at the moment there are no more questions. A couple of people have asked whether there would be the chance to send out the presentation slides afterwards to attendees. Not sure if you would be okay with that, Heidi, to provide the slides.
I think it would be more useful for me to send out the paper, actually, because the paper will have more. It will have the information that you can cite, right? If you're trying to, and it'll have more depth of explanation.
All right.
Than I've been able to even provide here.
Okay.
Yeah.
And actually, there's another question from Tien. She's asking whether you can recommend any resources for updated qualitative methodology.
There's quite a number of textbooks right now. I don't, have I guess it depends on what you want to do, right? There's textbooks that are sort of overviewing different qualitative methods, like John Creswell and Fred Wirtz both have a textbook that looks at, both of them have a format of looking at 5 qualitative methods and how they're applied differently. There are different textbooks that focus on what specific methods in more depth. And so it really depends on what you'd like to do. If you're not sure what method you would like to use, then you could look at a book that focuses more broadly. But then I think, if you're going to use one of the qualitative methods, you probably will want to get some books that are tailored to that kind of the approach that you want. I think that this, the paper that I'll send out to you is a good resource in terms of thinking about applying methods. There'll be, I think, an advancement in the field. I think that I'm hoping will help, and that I think will help actually in terms of reviewing and understanding qualitative methods will be the paper by the American Psychological Association Task Force that I think should be out sometime around February. In the American Psychologist. So those are other resources that you could look for.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And somebody else has just asked a question which I accidentally deleted. So if you could kindly type this again. I just saw that we only have another 5 minutes left, but somebody, Daniela Mogia, also asked another question. I would like to ask a logistic technical question. How do you transcribe your audios or videos for analyzing them?
Morgenthaler has a set of transcription guidelines that was published in Psychotherapy Research. I can't remember the year though; it was quite a while ago. But those are you could look at those if you're looking for transcription guidelines. I often am it depends also, I think, on the the purpose of your research. Whether you need to have very, very detailed and attuned transcription guidelines. But those are available, they're in the journal if people are interested in looking for that. I often have, my biggest advice is that if you're doing qualitative research, if you can transcribe your research within a day or at the most 2 days of your interview, you'll be very happy because you'll be able to hear so much better because it'll be in your immediate memory. And I often recommend that students try to transcribe any interviews they do within 2 days.
Okay, but I'm not sure if this answers the question. I thought that maybe it could also mean how you do it technically. So do you?
Oh, I see. Some people like to use software. There's like Naturally Speaking Dragon. I have some students who've liked to use that and found that to be useful. I've had other students who have tried it and not found it to be useful. Felt that it didn't speed up their process. So I think it's more idiosyncratic. In my experience, it's more idiosyncratic. Some students I find really like that. Some don't.
Okay.
There's also transcription. There's places that you can send transcripts, if you have funding, and people can transcribe for you. But then you would need to, let them know what sorts of criteria you have for the transcription.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. So there's no more questions at the moment. So, and I think we have to come to an end now. Our time is almost past. Would you like to finish up, Heidi, or is there some final words that you would like to say?
I don't really have anything more really. I mean, I think that I guess the last thing I'd want to do would just be to encourage you as researchers to be to be expressing your thoughts about your methods as you're going through review processes. I think sometimes sometimes researchers feel apprehensive about communicating with editors and with reviewers about their rationales for their method and how they're thinking about their research. And in my experience, when researchers put forward cogent and clear rationales for why they're doing certain procedures or the goals that they have for their research, often these are very well received. So I would encourage you, as you're doing your research, when you meet up with reviewers or editors who are not understanding something about your work, to look for resources to support what you're doing and to try to express yourself and communicate what you think is right for your work.
All right. Great. Thank you very much. So we are coming to an end. Thank you very much, Heidi, for this very interesting and inspiring talk. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for listening in and your questions, your active participation. I would like to add that we recorded this webinar and it will be available to SBR members from the SBR website, and we will send out an email once this is available. And I would also like to let you know that we will hold another webinar at the end of August, beginning of September, with a talk from Miguel Gonçalves. And we will also inform you about this once we have the dates. And hopefully next time we will not have technical problems to start with, and this will run more smoothly. Sorry again for the problems that we had at the beginning, and thanks for bearing with us. So we hope you enjoyed this talk. Thank you again, Heidi. And yeah, thank you and goodbye.